Puyi ascending the dragon throne at merely 2 years old, his entire perception of reality was warped from the very beginning. Raised in absolute isolation inside the Forbidden City, the young emperor grew up completely detached from the human suffering of the outside world. He was taught that he was a living god, a belief that completely eroded his capacity for natural empathy. Decades later, after losing his empire, his desperate hunger for his former royal status led him to become a puppet ruler for the Japanese Empire. His willing collaboration tied his reign directly to the horrific oppression and violent war crimes inflicted upon the Chinese people under foreign control. Ivan VI of Russia. He was crowned Tsar of all Russia when he was a fragile baby of only 2 months old. His reign was nothing more than a brief illusion, lasting barely a year before a violent palace coup violently overthrew his regents. The infant was ripped from his mother's arms and locked away in absolute terrifying secrecy for the remainder of his tragic life. His mere existence as the rightful heir triggered waves of brutal purges, endless executions, and suffocating paranoia within the Russian court. The boy grew up in total isolation, never seeing the sun or learning to speak properly before finally being murdered by his own guards at age 23. Tutankhamun crowned at the fragile age of 9, the boy king inherited a massive empire, deeply traumatized and torn apart by the religious revolution of his father. Though history often remembers him as a weak and sickly boy, his rule was entirely controlled by ruthless, battle-hardened military advisors. Under their strict manipulation, his regime violently and aggressively restored the old religious authority of the supreme god Amun. His government enacted incredibly harsh punishments, completely erasing his father's legacy and mercilessly persecuting anyone who resisted the return to the old, violent ways. Shapur II. According to ancient historical records, he is the only monarch in human history to be officially crowned before he was even born. Taking absolute control of the vast Sasanian Empire the moment he came of age, his unusual youth did not forge a gentle or merciful leader. Instead, he grew into a relentless, terrifyingly brutal war leader who made it his life's mission to ruthlessly crush the encroaching Roman armies. To forcefully solidify his divine authority at home, he initiated a massive and terrifying persecution of religious minorities, slaughtering countless Christians within his borders. King Baldwin IV crowned. At the young age of 13, he is famously known throughout history as the tragic leper king of Jerusalem. Despite his rotting flesh and the immense, constant physical pain he endured, he was violently thrust into the blood-soaked world of the Crusades. Extreme violence, desperate survival, and the constant smell of death completely defined his harsh leadership. Forced to constantly defend his fragile kingdom from the brilliant tactician Saladin, Baldwin led campaigns of extreme brutality, fighting without a shred of mercy because he knew his own life would be brutally short. Elagabalus crowned the absolute Emperor of Rome at the tender age of 14. His horrific reign plunged the entire empire into bizarre, bloody, and terrifying chaos. He deliberately attempted to replace the revered head of the Roman pantheon with a foreign sun god, deeply offending the entire powerful Roman political establishment. His monstrous rule was rapidly defined by extreme physical cruelty, bizarre sexual excesses, and actual human sacrifices made to his strange, foreign deity. His wildly erratic and monstrous behavior completely destabilized the mighty empire, leading directly to his brutal and bloody assassination by his own disgusted guards when he was just 18. Akbar. Though history fondly remembers him much later in life as Akbar the Great, he was crowned at only 13. and his early reign was completely soaked in innocent blood, operating heavily under the strict, violent control of his ruthless regent. The young king was systematically trained to be a cold instrument of death. Following a massive military victory, the young Akbar was forcefully encouraged to sever the head of a defeated, paralyzed enemy general to rightfully earn the title of a holy warrior. His highly formative early years were severely marked by violent conquests, the merciless slaughter of rival garrisons, and a ruthless territorial expansion that built the very foundation of his empire on literal mountains of corpses. Mary I of England. Though she officially became the reigning queen at 25, her incredibly monstrous reign of terror was entirely shaped by the deep psychological trauma of her early youth. Cruelly declared an illegitimate bastard by her own father, King Henry VIII, as she endured many terrifying years of psychological abuse and constant fear for her own life. When she finally seized ultimate absolute power, this deeply rooted trauma aggressively transformed into a fanatical, terrifying reign of religious fear and vengeance. She quickly became known to history as Bloody Mary, deliberately ordering the horrific, agonizing executions of nearly 300 religious opponents by burning them alive at the stake. Emperor Yang of Sui, rising to supreme power as a very young, highly ambitious prince. His absolute unyielding obsession with his own historical legacy quickly turned him into an uncontrollable monster. Widely suspected of brutally murdering his own father to accelerate his rapid rise to the throne, he immediately began ordering massive, tyrannical mega projects. He violently forced millions of poor peasants into deadly, backbreaking slave labor to construct the sprawling Grand Canal and to frantically rebuild the Great Wall. His complete sociopathic disregard for human life caused millions to die of brutal starvation and physical exhaustion, ultimately triggering a massive bloody rebellion that violently destroyed his entire dynasty. King John of England. Highly influenced by a toxic youth spent constantly plotting against his own father and brothers, John rapidly grew into one of England's most exceptionally cruel and treacherous rulers. When he finally took the highly coveted throne, his deep-seated paranoia led directly to acts of profound, unforgivable evil, including the alleged highly secretive murder of his own teenage nephew to permanently eliminate a royal rival. He was widely infamous across the land for deliberately starving his political enemies to death in dark dungeons, including the innocent wife and young son of a former trusted ally. His legendary, insatiable greed, his extreme, crushing taxation, and his arbitrary, sadistic cruelty eventually pushed his powerful barons to violent revolt, forcing him at sword point to sign the Magna Carta. Caligula, taking the absolute throne of Rome in his early 20s, the profound psychological trauma of his terrifying youth incredibly quickly mutated into absolute, bloodthirsty madness. Raised by the deeply paranoid and highly sadistic Emperor Tiberius, young Caligula learned very early that ultimate power meant the absolute ability to inflict horrific suffering entirely without consequence. He completely ruled the vast empire through sheer, unpredictable terror, extreme, sleepless paranoia, and bizarre, incredibly violent public executions. He genuinely believed in his own corrupted mind that he was a literal living god, forcefully making the empire endure his cruel, sick whims until his own exhausted guards finally butchered him in a dark hallway. Nero crowned the supreme emperor of the known world at just 16 years old. He was initially completely manipulated by his incredibly ambitious and highly deadly mother. However, the intoxicating taste of absolute power incredibly quickly corrupted his young mind, completely turning him from an aspiring poet and artist into a deeply paranoid, murderous monster. He coldly and ruthlessly ordered the brutal execution of his own mother, his multiple wives, and countless respected senators simply to secure his absolute and unquestioned authority. Nero's chaotic, blood-soaked reign quickly became the ultimate historical symbol of highly destructive leadership, climaxing violently with his horrific, sadistic persecution of early Christians, whom he literally burned alive to illuminate his private gardens. Vlad the Impaler. Ruling at a remarkably young age, Vlad's incredibly monstrous and highly sadistic nature was completely forged in the brutal fires of a deeply traumatic, highly abusive childhood. Held strictly captive by the powerful Ottoman Empire as a young boy, he was systematically psychologically broken and carefully taught the absolute darkest arts of human torture and psychological warfare. When he finally returned to aggressively claim his rightful throne, he immediately utilized sheer, unadulterated terror as his primary, go-to weapon to maintain absolute control over his highly chaotic lands. He routinely impaled his political enemies, common criminals, and even entirely innocent villagers in horrifying, massive, blood-soaked displays of absolute power that deeply shocked even the most hardened, violent warlords of Europe. Ivan the Terrible crowned the Grand Prince of Moscow at the incredibly fragile age of 3 and officially crowned Tsar at 16. His entire childhood was a literal living nightmare of severe physical abuse and extreme emotional neglect. Orphaned exceptionally young, the cruel Russian nobility routinely humiliated, starved, and heavily tortured him, completely twisting his fragile young mind into a dark, impenetrable knot of extreme paranoia and uncontrollable rage. When he finally managed to violently seize absolute power for himself, he immediately unleashed a highly systematic, deeply terrifying reign of absolute terror, unlike anything the vast country of Russia had ever seen before. He rapidly created a completely ruthless secret police force to violently purge the Russian nobility, leading directly to mass public executions, extreme torture, and the deliberate burning of entire, highly populated cities out of sheer, unhinged, psychotic suspicion. Genghis Khan, rising to ultimate, unquestioned power through unimaginable, incredibly brutal hardship, the young boy originally named Temujin was cruelly cast out of his own tribe to die alone in the incredibly harsh, freezing steppes. His highly formative youth was entirely defined by incredibly brutal daily survival, leading him eventually to violently murder his own older half-brother over a seemingly simple, incredibly desperate dispute involving stolen food. This remarkably ruthless, unyielding iron will to survive completely transformed him into a supreme, highly calculated military genius and an absolute, deeply terrifying monster to his many enemies. He violently united the warring tribes and aggressively forged the absolute largest contiguous land empire in all of human history, leaving behind literal mountains of human skulls and entire, massively populated cities utterly wiped from the very face of the earth.